Hello everyone, welcome to the Farmer Files. This is episode 3. I have a short disclaimer for the start of this episode, so bear with me for a moment. I had originally planned for this to be one very long episode. However, due to video length restrictions on unverified accounts, I had to split this project into 3 separate episodes. I am also using a new app, so hopefully the quality of this video will be better than the previous ones. But it also means I am learning an entirely new program, so forgive my errors as I learn the program. This is the first video in a 3-part series on the La Llorona myth. This video is going to speak on the myth in modern society, lay a basis of what La Llorona is, and the different versions. While this episode deals with some lighter aspects than the next 2 will, I do still feel it appropriate to warn you that some viewers may find the content of this episode disturbing. La Llorona is in many cases considered a very malignant being, responsible for the death of children and women. Suicides, murder-suicides, and infanticide are all tied to La Llorona as well. It is tied in with death cults, child sacrifice, and cannibalistic infanticide. While I try to be tactful, these topics cannot be avoided, so please watch with caution. And I would advise against children watching the video or being in the room while you are. That being said, my name is Rhiannon Lewis, and you are watching the Farmer Files. Thank you for joining us in our investigation. How does one approach the validation of the paranormal? By definition, the paranormal is something which cannot be explained. Webster Dictionary defines it as, quote, not understandable in terms of known scientific laws and phenomena. Unquote. Its existence cannot be proved through science. Ghost hunters and other groups attempt to, using EVP, infrared cameras, and a host of other technological means. Others try to use seances and mediums to validate experiences, or sometimes to create experiences. But the former always leaves room for doubt. The evidence provided is always lukewarm at best and easily dismissed by a critic. The latter can hardly be considered hard evidence. So when I was given the task of researching the La Llorona myth and its validity, based on Derek's article, but also independent of it, I was posed with a problem. I do not trust either method listed above, as you might be able to tell. Therefore, how can I expect you to? I could not present this type of evidence to you, evidence which I would not accept to prove or disprove anything myself. So this episode will not be employing either of these techniques. Instead, we will be analyzing the validity of the La Llorona myth through a completely different lens, the cultural. I am of the belief that every myth and legend has a basis in reality. I consider this a type of trial, with each culture being a witness. If enough witnesses' stories converge, one can only conclude they are telling the truth. In this mock trial, our witnesses are various cultures around the world. You are the jury. As for myself, I am both prosecutor and defense attorney, presenting to you all evidence I can find on the matter. But we must first start with a definition. So, what is La Llorona? La Llorona translates to the wailing woman, and her wailing is her most defining property. She is deeply rooted in Hispanic culture and tradition, with the modern La Llorona believed to have originated during the conquest of Mexico. She is single-handedly responsible, according to Hispanic culture, for the murder of innumerable children and women by drowning. She can possess women, not explicitly mothers, and force them into suicide. What science would explain as postpartum depression, culture explains as La Llorona, who may drive a new mother to madness and infanticide. Many believe that she is an aspect and perhaps the origin of the Santa Muerte cult. In 1986, a Hispanic Texan woman attempted to kill herself and her 7 children by driving off a bridge and into the river. She and several of her children survived. She was a domestic abuse victim, and when questioned as to why she chose to take her and her children's life, she stated that she had become La Llorona. This is only one example of La Llorona's influence. There are numerous versions of La Llorona, varying by time and geographical location. The backstory, appearance, and behavior of the spirit varies. I have tried to simplify these versions into a list for convenience, but this by no means encompasses all of the different versions. The Wailing Woman in White. This first version seems to be the most pervasive, found in the Philippines, Mexico, Honduras, Panama, and the southern United States. This La Llorona is described as a tall, skeletally thin woman dressed in a long white garment. Her hair is black, her eyes are sunken, and she is waxy in appearance, as if dead. She is seen walking the banks of rivers and lakes, or even walking across the surface of the water, crying incessantly. She will appear to children and women, and when sighted begins wailing loudly. In some cases, she is reported as trying to drag her victims forcibly into the water and hold them there until they are drowned. Other times, she appears in front of the individual, who then runs blindly into the river out of terror. The Mourning Woman. This version seems to be a more modern version, and is reported more in New Mexico, Southern California, and Arizona than anywhere in Old Mexico, according to my research. This La Llorona cries, but does not scream in the manner of the other version. Additionally, she is dressed in mourning black, with a thick veil over her face. Rather than appearing only by water, she appears in a variety of locations, and does not always seek to murder her victims. She seems to be more of a bad omen or a warning than anything. One supposed encounter in New Mexico featured 3 children who had an argument with their mother and decided to run away. They took the wagon, and halfway to the next town, a mysterious black-clad woman wearing a thick mourning veil appeared on the front seat between the 2 eldest brothers. She reportedly said nothing and refused to move or look at the boys. When the boys decided maybe they ought to just go home and turned the wagon around, she told them she would visit them again if they fought with their mother. This version of the La Llorona is relatively uncommon and seems to follow rebellious children and abusive parents more often than other groups. Interestingly, she appears to not be tied to any type of water. Other reports of the mourning La Llorona see her outside of windows, looking in at the children and crying softly, almost longingly. She seems to be a more ominous than murderous figure. The third version, which, for a lack of a better name, I have called the Cheshire Lady or Cheshire La Llorona. I only found a few accounts of this version, all occurring in the Southern California area, but I found it disturbing enough to include. This version of the La Llorona is one of the rare times she is black-clad, but she lacks the mourning veil and is much more murderous than the mourning La Llorona. Her aim seems to be to either drive children and or adolescents to their death, or simply terrify them to death. In this version, she has no eyes, merely empty black sockets, and a mouth which has been distorted until it is wider than any human mouth should be. When she smiles, which she does instead of screaming in these cases, it is terrifying and gruesome, and I have come to describe it in my notes as being akin to the Cheshire Cat. She has been seen at the feet of children's beds, or in the woods where children are playing. One report states that she appeared in a young boy's room and somehow convinced the boy to follow her out into the woods, only to suddenly whirl on him and scream at him to run. The boy was so terrified that he simply ran, with no regard as to where he was running to. He reported that if he had not tripped over a rock and fallen, he would have ran over a cliff and into the river far below. These are not the only versions of La Llorona, only the 3 which were easiest to condense and explain. The most common explanation of how La Llorona came into existence, according to myth, is a story about a young Mexican woman named Maria. This version was later popularized in plays and movies. While she was naturally beautiful, Maria was a very shallow woman, and refused to marry any except the most handsome man she could find. She eventually wooed a handsome ranchero. Once married, they had 2 children together. But the young ranchero soon realized that while his wife was very beautiful, she was also very demanding and jealous. He much preferred his previous life of running free on the plains. According to La Llorona, a Mexican folk story, quote, "In some versions, the ranchero is unfaithful to Maria, and in others she merely resents his emotional indifference in comparison to the attention he continues to bestow upon their children. Her children drowned, and many versions of the tale suggest their death was deliberate and at her own hands, prior to drowning herself. When Maria is refused entry to heaven without her children, she is forced to search the waters for their remains during her afterlife." Unquote. La Llorona, the weeping woman of the Southwest, offers a different version of the story, again focusing on the beautiful Maria. Quote, another legend says that La Llorona was a caring woman full of life and love, who married a wealthy man who lavished her with gifts and attention. However, after she bore him 2 sons, he began to change. He seemingly no longer cared for the beautiful Maria. When he did return home, it was only to visit his children, and the devastated Maria began to feel resentment toward the boys. One evening, as Maria was strolling with her 2 children on a shady pathway near the river, her husband came by in a carriage with an elegant lady beside him. He stopped and spoke to his children, but ignored Maria, and then drove the carriage down the road without looking back. After seeing this, Maria went into a terrible rage and turned against her children. She seized them and threw them into the river. As they disappeared downstream, she realized what she had done and ran down the bank to save them, but it was already too late. Maria broke down into unconsolable grief, running down the street screaming and wailing. The beautiful La Llorona mourned them day and night. During this time, she would not eat and walked along the river in her white gown, searching for her boys, hoping they would come back to her. She cried endlessly as she roamed the river banks, and her gown became soiled and torn. When she refused to eat, she grew thinner and appeared taller until she looked like a walking skeleton. Still a young woman, she finally died on the banks of the river. Where did this myth come from? Is it simply a bedtime story to scare unruly children with, or does it have a basis in reality? Where and when did it originate? We will be discussing these and more in the next episode, going back to the ancient Aztecs and also discussing the ties between La Llorona and Sentimientos. That episode will be much harsher than this episode was, and again, I advise caution when watching this series. Thank you very much for joining us. I will try to put a very peaceful and serene scene for our ending notes here, as I usually do. But especially so after dealing with these hard topics. Articles and any photos that I use that weren't stock images, the references can be found at the end of this video. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will see you next time.